Hi, my name is Zenka Caro. I'm founder of LightNet, and Adam and I went up to San Francisco to the Sol Foundation Symposium last weekend, and this is an update on what you missed. The Sol Foundation Symposium was centered around academics, research, public policy, funding, and the road forward for a UAP research in the United States and beyond. And they had speakers from all over the world coming to talk from different angles. I'm going to go through the speakers and their main points, what we learned. This was not a disclosure conference about nitty-gritty details which are not in the press. This was more about how to get organized to do further research, to reduce stigmas, to increase legitimacy, to look at what data sets we have, to look at how funding might work, to look at how the government might operate with the private sector, with academia, and the road forward. So that was the general gist. For those of you who are not familiar with the Sol Foundation, it was founded by Gary Nolan, who's from Stanford. He's an oncologist. He's a researcher studying cancer. He's interested in the brain. He's also now interested in crash retrievals and materials surrounding that. Peter Starfish is also part of the 5 founders. He's a sociologist, anthropologist, and he is also interested in how this is all going to play out. Maura Mandrilla is head of strategy, and Charles McClough is general counsel. And they also have Jonathan Burke, who is the founder of RoboVision, which uses machine vision and other things to take a look at problems. And he's also working a lot with AI and machine learning to look at some of the data that is coming out. The first talk was Update from the Front Lines, Aviation Safety with Ryan Graves and Leslie Keane. Now, Leslie Keane is the New York Times writer that broke a lot of this story into the mainstream in 2017. And Ryan Graves has been arguing for aviation safety. One of the interesting things that Leslie said in the talk was that it doesn't appear that there's any evidence that UAPs pose a threat to humans, which I thought was really great because that seems to be the missing data point that we're all not addressing as we house most of this conversation, at least until now, within military. Now, Ryan Graves was interesting too. He said that I don't think UAPs have any collision danger because of their advanced systems with planes. It's been very rare that that has taken place. However, he said the threat is that a pilot doesn't realize this and is confronted with the UAP in the cockpit and doesn't know what to do and swerves and moves, and that can be dangerous. There have been people who have been injured, they said, from a flight where the pilot has moved to evade or been startled by a UAP. So he talked about the existential crisis that some of these pilots can go through when they're seeing something like that that's absolutely unhinging them. And he talked about the Aviation Safety Act as being something that he really wants everyone to get behind. So what is this? It's a way to train every single pilot to understand how to report things, but understand also that they're appearing, that they exist. So this was really interesting kind of point of view on this. The next talk was with Tim Gallaudet, who talked about the underwater UAP phenomenon. And as you know, he has also testified in Congress last week about the situation and how some of these things are just being overly classified and not being seen. So he's a very refreshing, kind guy who's a good face for this whole disclosure movement within the government just because he feels so wholesome. The next talk was called The Politics of the Executive Branch UAP Secrecy. And it included Eric Davis, who's a physicist and a consultant for the government and private companies, and Kirk McConnell. Peter Starfish was the one that ran this fireside. And it was an interesting conversation because we did get a few disclosure tidbits. What they explained was there's many special access programs. So these are, he said, over 1,500, I believe, of these programs. And they said for these intelligence communities to read in governments and presidents on this would take literally 2 years of their first term of presidency if they were going to be read into every single special access program. And so what they do is that they only bring this information out when it's necessary on a need-to-know basis. And here's the list of what they said in terms of which presidents have been or have not been read into the UFO intelligence. Reagan, yes. Nixon, yes. Kennedy, yes. Eisenhower, yes. And they said recently the Bush was only very partially read in. Clinton was not read into the policy. Carter was read in. And Trump was also read into the UFO program, but not the crash retrieval program. I really liked hearing from Eric because he's a geek in every sense of the word, which I love because he talked about things like alien programmable vehicles. So they talked a lot about quantum programmable materials. So these are the kinds of things that we haven't begun to understand how to create, but there's things that are being observed and studied and are super fascinating. One of the things that Adam was very excited about was the fact that they mentioned that the president can actually decide which things should be unclassified. So this is really interesting, and we think that Trump is going to be, well, he has stated that he will unclassify some of the JFK information, but this could be our best chance at a disclosure that happens more quickly. This group at the Sol Symposium, some of the speakers talk about how maybe this isn't a good idea, and we're going to go into what they said about that. But this is an interesting thought that the executive branch can really go in and decide certain things in terms of what gets disclosed, especially to Congress. You know, Congress is the one that has really been left out of this in terms of their debriefing. One of the things that came out in this panel discussion also was sole source contracts. And they talked about how, you know, a lot of this UAP things are being done by different companies that are, I wouldn't say above the law, but they're not privy to some of the congressional demands for information and knowledge and disclosure on this. So being private helps some of this stuff stay a little bit under wraps. Aside from congressional oversight, they talked a little bit about the whistleblower issue. Though they said that, you know, there are whistleblower laws in place right now, oftentimes there is a way to get around some of this stuff, and that these people that have come out as whistleblowers have really had a lot of impact on their career, whether it's through medical records being released or otherwise. And there's a lot of different ways that you can, they said, come at a witness from a lot of different angles in their personal lives that are really disruptive, that can kind of sit outside of this witness protection whistleblower protection plan. So they said it really is a huge problem still. They mentioned only 2 people that they knew that had physical threats to their physical bodies but that, the career issue is always a problem. So this is really something to be addressed. And they talked about how whistleblower protection is going to be difficult because in Congress, you can't really say, okay, we're going to change the whistleblower protection laws for UAP people, but not for other people that are also fighting corruption and things like that in the government. So it's a little bit of a legislative difficulty that they're undergoing. Next, we had Japan's role in creating international cooperation on the UAP issue. Asakawa, who was part of the parliament. He wasn't elected back in, but he's been asked to continue on, to come on, to speak to the parliament, to bring up these issues, and to start to get reporting and things in place in Japan. He was a very sweet man, and he asked for help, and he said him being at the conference was really helpful because it helps the Japanese government look more concretely on these issues as a valid concern. Now, in our Contact Japan conference, as you know, or some of you know, there was testimony from certain people that claimed that the Japanese government is fully involved in ET and UFO projects. So it's hard to tell. There's these different sectors of belief and understanding that really don't mix sometimes. So whether this stuff is happening in the private sector and the government doesn't know, or whether the government knows and is not saying anything, it's quite an interesting series of groups that are at various layers of understanding of what actually is happening. Probably one of the most beloved talks of the whole conference was about the archives of the impossible with Jeff Krimple and Karen Austin. And it was really inspiring. They started with the archives of Jack Valet, who was saying, where do I put all this stuff? And they said, oh, well, maybe you can put it with us at Rice University. And that was 10 years ago. And since then, they have incorporated and archived the works of Mack from Harvard, and also Whitley Strieber, who was there in attendance, which was wonderful. And it was a very inspiring talk about all that is going on here from experiencers, for example, that have written into Whitley Strieber. And, we're talking hundreds and hundreds. I think they even said 3,000 letters have been written. At lunch, I met a young researcher at Rice University who is culling through all of these letters. And he says that they're not archiving them in a digital form for people to anywhere in the world to just look at. You actually have to go into the archives, request certain boxes, and then sit down with them, take your notes, etc. But for the privacy of the people writing the letters, they didn't really want to make this just out there for everyone to read, digitized on the internet. But he, for example, is doing research in implants. And he said, you can look at the patterns of these letters. He said that you could see that a lot of these implants can be seen with blacklight. So, someone's foot will be slightly glowing. I believe he said green, using the black light. He also said that one other thing was that these implants are wrapped actually in the biological cell structure with the blood and tissues of the host person, and that those are often wrapped around the implants. This young researcher also talked about how they are noticing just absolutely interesting amounts of different composites, material composites that we just don't have here, and that it's very fascinating. He mentioned that there was someone that had an implant that didn't want to get it taken out. Often they're very difficult to remove and very dangerous to remove, in the sense that it might damage the person's brain, etc. And so he said that this person donated their implant to science after they had died. And that could be something interesting for future generations of people to sign waivers to say, yeah, I do have an implant. I would like it to be studied posthumously. So that was a lot of energy. The Archives of the Impossible are having a conference in April. We encourage everyone to get down there for it. This is a great group of people that are doing research there. The next talk was about UAPs and religion. So they really covered the gamut. This was with Ted Peters and Stephen Finley. Ted Peters couldn't be heard with his remote audio, so I will talk about Stephen Finley, who I absolutely adored. He was amazing, and he talked about how the Black culture views UAPs, and he said, you know, they don't fear UAPs because they see it as part of their, you know, identity, in the sense that it's a empowerment narrative coming from Egypt and also Islam. So he talked about how Muhammad, who was the founder of Islam, that came to pass, and that there was different people that were vying to carry on the tradition. But Farrakhan, who was spending time down in Mexico, talked about seeing this mother wheel, and he talks about it being part of their, you know, lore, religion, discourse, etc., as being something really powerful, and that they use it in music with Sun Ra and the UFO twins and other culture to be a strong element of resistance and something that they feel is very hopeful and important. And looking back over the Elijah Muhammad, what he talked about this mother whale, they talked about it costing over $15 billion. It's a man-made sort of planet with 150, or was it 1,500, I don't recall, little mini wheels in that, almost like subships. And then it was built in Japan, at the time, which is now called Japan, Nippon. So it was very interesting to hear how different groups of people are treating this in different ways. And we'll hear about worst case scenario planning as well. So it was really interesting to see how different cultures perceive this phenomenon and how they see the future of it, whether they treat it with fear or empowerment. The last talk of the day was with Mitch Randall. He filled in, he was plucked out of the audience because Jack Valet wasn't feeling well and couldn't attend. And Mitch Randall was the consummate citizen scientist on steroids. He developed a system and a methodology for a radar system that would allow for triangulation based on 10,000 different radar units that people would buy for $500 or less, place in their house, and then we could have a grid across the United States that would open source and open up all of the skies. So in other words, when you triangulate the location, it was really encouraging because he said that this FM radio system with the radars would enable us to understand the velocity, the position, and the acceleration of the crafts. On the second day, we have Avi Loeb from Harvard, who founded the Galileo project, and he is a huge hero to me and everyone else. Why? Because he has cemented a narrative that is acceptable for academia to grab onto. What is his narrative? Is, hey, we've got to be curious. How can we not be curious as scientists? Are you kidding me? And he's saying, don't put a hypothesis ahead of the evidence. The second day started out with Matthew Pine and Gary Nolan in this idea around evidence in UAPs. And Gary Nolan was very passionate about this, sticking to the scientific community and the understanding that evidence really needs to rule these hypotheses. And he walked us through different steps of how you gather conclusions based on a set of evidence. You know, you've got data, which is just data, and then you've got evidence, which is saying, oh, based on this conclusion I have, this is the evidence that supports that conclusion. So he really wanted to pull the audience back into these standard practices whereby we can communicate more effectively to people. So Wendt is studying the whole idea of worst case scenario planning. And unlike what I think the common person thinks of when they think of UAPs is, oh, they're coming to kill us, they're coming to mine stuff, they're coming to hurt us, harm us, whatever. But he didn't seem to go that way in all his research. He talked more about the end of government, actually. So he talked about that being extremely threatening. He said that the people look to the government to protect them, and that this would be considered a breach in protection that they can't deal with. He talked about how we are going to have to come to terms with the fact that we're not the smartest kid on the block, and that could be very demoralizing. So it was interesting. He talked about, a crisis of faith, and panic, demoralization, and crisis of faith, which he said is the standard right now of why people think disclosure should be slowed down or etc. But he said that what's really going to come about is people are going to realize, hey, we are not alone. We are not sovereign, so there's another higher order of being. And he said that this was, a massive ontological shock that was coming out, that we might feel inferior, and that the state and the government is not going to be able to protect us, and that this is therefore a very dangerous idea to do disclosure. Now, I talked with Adam on the plane about this, and he said, no, people are much more resilient than that, and that it's better to build a starting point where everyone comes clean, that all the truth is important as a starting point to move on from. And I think it was interesting how we talked about all this governmental, how we could do things differently starting from now. And it would be very interesting if the government started to research some of this curiosity, and that we started getting onto this new program of, oh, they're here, now what? And one of the things that I really felt strongly about throughout this whole conference was that there didn't seem to be any best case scenario planning going on. So in a male-dominated culture, military culture, budgeting culture, governmental culture, this is what we're getting. We're getting a lot of the UAP stuff going into the going into the military. And so is that the best place for it? So really, I think this highlights the fact that it's great because women are making more decisions in the world. And I think this is part of the reason why this can happen, is that one of the things that we would like to do is think about what are the best case scenarios? How do we want the future to go? And this goes back to consciousness. If you study consciousness fundamentally, you know that the things you focus on end up happening. So if your focus is on negativity and protection, etc., I'm not saying you don't focus on that at all or you don't acknowledge it, because that's very important as well. But what do we expect to happen if we haven't even considered the best case scenario planning? So I think that's where the Dream Machine comes in, and LightNet. That's where we'd really like to push this idea of what are the possibilities? How would we want to interact with ETs? What could be the benefit to us? Where could we go medically? Where could we go in the galaxy? How could we travel? What could we learn, et cetera, which is a much more compelling carrot to get through some of this sadness and confusion about what's happened in the past. The next talk was Avi Loeb from Harvard, Galileo Project, and of course I am a huge fan of him. in addition to his science, he's done something very important, monumental, I dare say, for the academic community, which has given them a very short, simple narrative for everyone to grab onto. What is that narrative? That narrative is saying, hey, as scientists, we must be open-minded. We must be open-minded to the evidence we have. He often talks about how other people hide those anomalous things that come out in the data and just push those back because they're not supporting the conclusion that the scientist wants to make. But he talks about how these, that we need to go open-mindedly into these investigations and let the evidence bring about our new conclusions and ideas about the world. The second thing that he does that's really important with allowing people to attach to a certain narrative is he says, hey, why shouldn't we be learning from the smartest kids on the block? So he really thinks that there's no possible way that we're the only intelligent person. And of course, we would want to learn from other beings. So he talked about his progress. It's incredible to see how much work and effort goes into building these machines. He's built a new machine that looks like an R2-D2, and it has all sorts of camera sensing devices on it, and they just calibrated it last week, similar to what Mitch had presented. They want to put, I believe, 3 more out there so that they can get the triangulation and the positioning statistics on it. But it's incredible how much has to go into this. But he said, look, if we were able to actually have a map of the United States, and you'd be able to see the lines of these crafts moving in ways that were absolutely impossible, this would be a really great proof point. The Dalek R2-D2 looking capture device has 8 cameras. They've captured 500,000 different airplanes, and I believe they only got it calibrated last week, although maybe some of the prior stuff was captured in that. They said 16% are showing curves instead of straight lines, and 144,000 are representing something that is ambiguous. So there's high hopes that this can do that. So in January 8th of 2014, there was an interstellar meteor captured by the US government, and he wanted to study this. And so he got together a boat, which he said was hilarious because it was called the Silver Star, but it was a boat that enabled him to go out there. They dove for it. They vacuumed up all this material. And what was so crazy is that he said the material was the size of a grain of sand, okay? And they went through all of this material to study its properties and materials, and they found, with the help of graduate students, over 850 of these tiny grains of sand which they could study. And what they learned was that, yes, indeed, this was outside of our solar system. So he wants to go back and do another $6 million dive and to do that. And as he says, extraordinary evidence takes extraordinary funding. It's mind-boggling the amount of money we spend doing other things that are way less productive. So I really hope that the Sol Foundation can capture some of this research funding and government funding to do some of these research projects, which are completely inspiring and life-affirming. In addition to finding all of this beryllium and all these interesting materials in these grains of sand, he talked about a new observatory in Chile that has the power, gigabytes of resolution. He said it's 1,000 times more powerful than your cell phone. So they're excited to see what they can see with that as well. It's a 3.2 gigapixels. The next talk we had was from Dr. Beatrice Varroyal. I loved that they had a female speaking as well, so they did work in the minorities, and it was great to hear her perspective. She claimed that she was looking for near-Earth remnants of ETs and UAPs, and that a lot of even the organizations that were studying extraterrestrial UFO and UAPs were still uncomfortable with her wanting to search so close to home. Now, this is an interesting statistic that she shared. In 2024, 69% of academics still feel that this topic is too difficult to touch and to research. So she said that they believe that they're not going to be able to collaborate with other people on papers if they go into this research. So she was talking about the stigma being significantly high. She also talked about a study in 1992 of 1356 astronomers, asking them, have you seen a UFO? And 62 of them have. So they're seeing it, but still not wanting to base any research on it. So some of the research questions she's interested in answering is, do UAPs cause physical harm? Do they cause harm to boats and planes? And can we find artifacts of non-human intelligence in the world? And she's talking about putting together a passion-based project outside of her academic research. It was interesting that she had to felt that she had to clarify that, which she probably did, of a European crash retrieval initiative that would help people get together and compare notes on. Perhaps the most controversial talk was next by Dr. James Beachman from CERN, who was really invited by the Sol Foundation to show what the other researchers and scientists in the world think of UAPs, the total skeptics. So he was beyond a skeptic and really said, hey, you guys don't have anything, show me some proof, I don't see it yet. He talked about how CERN is often accused of breaking, the Mandela effect, and what are they actually doing there. And he talked about all the discussions that go around about CERN. And he said, in relation to the UAPs, I really think that it discredits the whole conversation when people start talking about remote viewing, other abilities and other things, because he said for him, it's totally separate. And that stuff is very hard for him to believe, so it's hard for him to even take the UAP discussion seriously. And he talked about his research, and it was a very sobering talk, and I think it outlined this idea that, yeah, we need to, for a certain group of the population, come up with the bare bones statistics, the repeatable, measurable data sets that is required for someone like him to get on board with. One of the talks I liked the best was from Riz Burke, talking about investment strategies, how we can get research funding, how we can get commercial funding for this kinds of things. And he talked about it from his perspective of Silicon Valley and how things work. And he basically talked about the difference between deep tech and frontier tech. So, regular technology, the risk is only in the market. Like, is this going to sell well? Whereas deep tech, such as Tesla and SpaceX, the risk is in engineering and also in the market. Can you pull this off to do rockets and things like that? Frontier tech also requires science. So not only engineering and market, but it also requires science. And he says that whereas deep tech maybe is a 5-year out proposal, 10 years, you're looking at 10 years or more for the frontier technology. And he talked about how a lot of these things could be mitigated by checkpoints, where you're showing the investors along the way, okay, we're going to need to understand the science behind this and this, etc. He talked about how it's important to get some sort of emotional investment involved in this, because people that really want disclosure might be willing to fund the deep millions needed for some of the frontier technology, but they're going to want to do it probably less about money, because a lot of these products today, with everything that we have, 3D printers and all this stuff, can get to market very quickly. So it's very shocking for some of these investors, even for a VC fund that was organized around this, to want to invest in something that has such a long tail. He talked about how that there is an ecosystem which needs to be built in order to fund UAP research. And the first thing is that basic research needs to be done. So that's part of it. Then applied research is the second thing. Then technology development and innovation with a product that's market product fit. So these are different things, and they can be dealt with in different ways. So he talks about different roles that are involved. For example, I'll read this list: entrepreneurs, private foundations, governmental science, the DoD, intelligence community, large aerospace, venture capital funds, family offices, sovereign funds, university funds, research labs, scientists and engineering, and garage inventors. And he highlighted garage inventors quite frequently through his talk, because he's saying, look, some of these people are coming up to me and they have this technology, zero point energy thing that they've developed. So he said, you really can't leave those garage inventors out of the equation. So in that list, that's a lot of different people that could be potential funders. So he talked about there being different types of things that would be needed. For example, the research fund to take care of this first element, basic research, right? So this could be done by creating fellowships. We could create a UAP research fund in general, universities, private labs. But he talked about a clearinghouse of research proposals, which I absolutely think would be amazing if the Sol Foundation would be willing to put something like that together, because it would allow this list of inventors, the funders, from the family offices to the government, to cherry pick what they were most interested in funding and get an eye on, okay, because a lot of the funding, you really need to find a match between the funder or investor and the project, because some people it's just not a match. So having a pool of research would allow people to come up to the space and say, okay, I'm interested in implants, or I'm interested in human potential, I'm interested in evidence, I'm interested in crash retrievals, etc., material science, AI, whatever, and they could basically fund the group of research projects in that category pretty easily. It would also help the different organizations that are working in material science or UAP evidence or tracking to talk to each other. Okay, these people are also interested in this research, and how do we share physical space? How do we share equipment, etc.? He talked about in this funding, the UAP research fund, that the requirement would be to publish the research. And I think that would be the most economical way to spend this money, is that if you're going to pay someone to research it, obviously that they're going to share the data. And I think this could be, he said, even a federation of different labs. And I think that's kind of the frustration we're entering right now, is that a lot of this research data is locked up in defense companies, and none of the information is out there for other scientists to grow and build upon. The second idea he had was innovation prizes. And he said, just like the X Prize, we could start something called the U Prize. And he's like, a remarkable amount of innovation can happen when you dangle $1 million to $5 million, etc., in front of a certain research question. He talked about the Google Lunar Prize of 30 million. They didn't end up giving away the full prize, but they gave away 10 million in the process to different research and labs. So the third thing he mentioned was a deep tech or frontier tech incubator. So the idea, obviously, of an incubator is you get these, research, PhD students and things like that have these brilliant ideas but have no idea how to put together a business plan, a little bit of a grounding and support structure for them to start to put some of their work into a way that an investor could understand and fund. He also talked about in this idea to share a lab, common lab equipment so that you can reduce the cost of innovation. And number 4, he talked about VC funds, and he talked about the DoD, and I think that this, and garage inventors he mentioned again, and I think that's right. It would be interesting to see some of the government money, if they want things more transparent going forward, be interesting to see them instead funding research like this that would be shared. So all in all, I thought this was an incredible talk because it talked about what most people, he said, are even at the conference for, which was how do we fund this research? One of the last talks they had was from Jonathan Burke called Beyond Speculation, Setting the Record Straight on UAP Disclosure with AI. And Jonathan is part of the core team at Sol Foundation, and he comes from RoboVision, which develops ways for automation, machine learning, and robotics to do anything. Whether they showed a video of like a robot picking a tiny plant seed and placing it into something to, we went to the airport and we looked and we just set the bag down and all the cameras knew and scanned the item. So that's where his background is, but he's also interested in taking the machine learning and AI models, the latest and greatest, using graph databases and things like that, vector databases, to really look at all of the evidence that we have about UAPs and start to correlate that data into something meaningful that will give academic credibility to move forward and open the doors for further funding. He talked about the National Archives having a terabyte of information and archives.org, and he said that's been down for a couple days. So he's like, it's absolutely, a lot of researchers were putting up things on archives.org, realizing that that could be a permanent storage place, but archives.org, he said, has been down. So things like that are kind of unacceptable. And he talked about how there's, like, for material science, there's no central database that is tracking new materials, their properties, and the research around them. So I really like the idea of centralizing, having a database of databases, and at least having those so that more innovation can happen as it builds upon one another. The last talk was called the UAP NIH Hilbert Problems to Finding a Way Forward with Carl Neal in conversation with Gary Nolan. This was also one of the ones that I really loved because they talked about the different categories of research from the UAP to the material science to the psychology of what might be the buckets of research that we might look into. And I'm going to read them so we can see where different organizations would fit. So here's the list. In government, there's policy, information, finance, legal, and diplomacy. In the humanities, they talked about ethics, sociology, history and anthropology, and religious studies. One of the things they mentioned about this, they said, oh, it wouldn't be good to have a UAP, entire department in a university, but rather place UAP classes or courses within each of these subgroups. Natural science, data collection, citability, statistics, physics, material science, and biology. Industry and society, they thought we needed to look at the political advocacy, intellectual property, business, economics, integrity, and commerce. So in medicine, mental health and well-being, physical health research, physical health treatment, and what we're interested in LightNet is the exceptional health research and human potential research and human potential training. So there we found ourselves right there at the end. One of the things that was missing from this list, which is the elephant in the room, is consciousness is not listed. So Ray Hernandez obviously talks about how he believes that this whole phenomenon is consciousness based. So how can we not look at consciousness? And I guess that's really where LightNet lands in its research, is how does consciousness affect miracle healings? How does it affect the world that we live in and the world that we perceive? Because really that could be the only answer that we're looking for, the only answer that we need. So that is the wrap up from the conference. Again, this conference was really aimed at governmental policy, academic research, funding. How do we look at these things? How do we make this less stigmatized, and how do we get this research flowing? So it's really admirable what they put together. It was, like I said, it wasn't disclosure in any form, and that was not the point of the conference. We did, however, get to see the new movie called The Project, which was really interesting. James Fox interviewed a lot of these scientists, a lot of different officials, and it is similar to Ron James's film and talks a lot about what is going on with disclosure. So you will see that coming out soon, I believe. But in general, it was great to gather again the community together to make those contacts, those conversations happening, those collaborations happening, because as we know,